So what you are hearing is the healing song of traditional healer and shaman from the Mazatec people in Oaxaca, Maria Sabina, who was very important in the revolution of psychedelics in the modern world.
Very interesting. Hello, Professor Carl and everyone else. Um, I'm Eylül,
And
and
I'm
this is
Hash.
Hash. And today we're going to talk about psychedelics and their colonial history. So I want to start by asking, what's a trip? Because a trip is not simply a vacation to Italy. Today we're gonna dig deeper into the roots and history of psychedelic substances and their uses in ritualistic and cultural cases. So the nature of psychedelics suggests that substances like LSD and psilocybin are known for altering perceptions, emotions, and consciousness, and that is why they're mostly used for ritualistic and religious purposes. Um, the use of these substances have been utilized in ancient traditions worldwide for spiritual, therapeutic, and ceremonial purposes. And it's not really surprising to me that ancient people utilize these substances because, it's ancient times. You go out to pick up some berries and you're trying to make the most out of nature. So this is not a big shock that ancient people start to use these. They saw different effects and they brought these back to their communities. Really surprisingly to me, because there is not a lot of archived sources or digital sources on these substances. It's sort of like a global taboo, I think, but they're very present globally. There are evidence found in Native America's Mexico and Greece, even. There might be a link between these substances and the development of Christianity.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
even like Greek religion too.
Yeah, we're gonna dig deeper into the perceptions on these substances, but we can just say for now, during the Age of Conquest, European colonizers associated these substances with satanistic practices, and they pursued them as a risk for Christianity. The reason for that is very simple actually, because there is a huge contrast between the practices and context related to psychedelic rituals and Christianity. The fears, motivations, and rituals embedded in the religions are completely different than each other. So it's not a big shock that people pursued psychedelic substances and religions associated with them as a risk.
Yeah, there's even like there's pseudo scientific theories. There's one by like this very famous like cultural commentator slash like Western shaman called like Terence McKenna, which is called the stoned ape theory. And essentially what McKenna was proposing was that like even human consciousness, because in like I guess a biological time scale, like it developed like our brains developed very quickly as a species. Like what
Mhm.
he's proposing is that that happened because of mushrooms, because we were following like prey, and because the prey were
Oh.
pooping, yeah, and the like the poop is very like nitrogen rich,
Uh-huh.
and mushrooms grow in very nitrogen rich environments. The they were basically consuming these shrooms like, oh, what is this? And like they basically discovered, yeah,
Interesting.
like consciousness because of it. It's kind of scientifically unvalidated, but
Mm-hmm.
there's also like new ways of interpreting like by other scientists, right? Like so for example, there's a paper in Frontiers in Psychology called Psychedelic Sociality and Human Evolution, which talks about like the importance of mushrooms not necessarily as like an agent in themselves, but
Mm-hmm.
as a reinforcer in rituals, right? And like human
Mm-hmm.
sociality and that kind of like inherent sharing that we have as a species,
Mm-hmm.
and that mushrooms kind of like allowed a trance to happen in these spaces, and that allowed a
Mm-hmm.
lot of development. Yeah.
It's
Mm.
really interesting. And well, while I was researching, I came across this example of ayahuasca. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, it was it.
Okay. It's basically used by indigenous cultures of the Amazon basin, and it exemplifies the ritualistic use of natural psychedelics. It is mainly a brew made from Banisteriopsis, Kapi wine, and Psychotria viridis leaf. I'll put more details in the description, also about the chemistry of how these substances work. I want to talk about how the cultural and religious significance of ayahuasca is mentioned in some of the sources I looked at. So these ceremonies are integral to the spiritual traditions of many South American indigenous tribes, and they have been integrated into contemporary syncretic religious movements such as the Santo Daime, and the ceremonial practices are usually led by a shaman or a spiritual leader, and participants consume the ayahuasca in a ritualistic setting, often held at night. And the purpose and effects of these psychedelic mushrooms and similar substances and rituals is rooted in their ability to induce deep, mystical, and altered states of consciousness, which are believed to enable communications with the spiritual realm. Have you heard anything about this?
Yeah. So one of the interesting kind of like histories of mushrooms, right, is that they were like very already recognized by so many cultures around the
Mm-hmm.
world. As you mentioned with ayahuasca, like it's such an important part of like different like Ecuadorian and also Amazonian cultures.
Mm-hmm.
In Mexico, there's like so many examples, and like one of the earliest that we have is that there's like Mayan statues, and these statues are not only like of a particular period, like they run from the pre-classic period in the
Mm-hmm.
Mayans all the way to the post-classic, so like inside essentially the entire civilization,
Mm-hmm.
of like people like like either a person or an animal that
Mm-hmm.
has behind them like a very big like stone mushroom. So there's
Interesting.
a lot of different theories about them. Like some of them is that they're like agricultural, like praying like practices,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But in a lot of them cannot be studied properly because they were sacked and they were sent to like private collections. But
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be like because of like certain like pieces. Like for example, there's one with like a girl like grounding down like mushrooms,
Mm-hmm.
and like that's a particular part of the procedure in order to consume them in like a lot of like indigenous cultures in Mexico. So it seems to be like it's about like psychedelic mushrooms essentially.
Yeah, I would guess so as well. As far as I know, Aztecs are really good with agriculture, so I wouldn't be surprised that they're mushrooms. But
Yeah,
yeah.
like even the Aztecs themselves, right? They had a word for it called Tetonacat, which
Mm-hmm.
means the flesh of God, essentially.
Mm.
And there's like pictures, like there's many Aztec codex as well. They were also burned and stuff, so like a lot of the knowledge is lost. But from a lot of the colonial codexes,
Mm-hmm.
there's like pictures of people consuming mushrooms. So for example, we have that picture here from the
Mm-hmm.
like Codex Machiavellianus. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. Where there's like a man that is like, as you
Mm-hmm.
can see, like sitting down and he's
Yeah.
eating mushrooms, and the mushrooms are in the color of jade, which is like a sacred color.
Mm-hmm.
And behind him there's a god, and the god seems to be speaking, right? So and it's a god of death also. Like these like mushrooms were also very much related to like practices of death and like going to like
Mm.
the infra world and like etc. But yeah, I mean there seems to be a lot of evidence for it in the past. Yeah.
That's so cool. So now I want to move on to how the psychedelics were found and transported. So this dates way back before 1960s. It dates way back before hippie movement. It's actually first discovered by Europeans during the Age of Conquest. And there is a man I want to mention. His name is Bernardino de Sahagun, and he's a Spanish Franciscan friar, and he was instrumental in documenting these substances shortly after the conquest of Mexico. And his major work is called General History of the Things of New Spain, and it's widely known as the Florentine Codex. This book mainly contains his notes and experiences, the things he saw and documented from his own perspective during his time. It's okay. So one of the problematic things about this book is that this man arrived at New Spain as a missionary, and he had a very specific perspective on the indigenous people and indigenous practices while he noted down these findings. And it was really important for the scientists and people in Europe to have this evidence, because this developed an interest in terms of research in psychedelic substances later on. But his perspective and interpretations were really flawed and biased. He actually saw these practices satanic, and he perceived them as superstitions. And I think this stems from the colonial perspective of comparing everything to what you have back home, comparing anything you see to Christianity, and having Christianity as your base. So anything he sees there, whether good or bad, it's going to be somewhat flawed for him. And that's what he does, and that's what he reflects in his book. So yeah, that this should just give us a bit of more idea about how these major populations back in Europe were introduced to these different cultures and rituals.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And definitely there's kind of like a global rupture there, right, of
Yeah.
cultures. And I think there's a second one when like mushrooms are reintroduced to the Western world
Hmm.
through this person called Robert Wasson. So it's a very interesting story.
Hmm.
So essentially, Robert Wasson, he was this like amateur mycologist who was very interested in like mushrooms and found out about the possibility of there being like psychedelic mushrooms in Mexico. And he didn't know exactly what they were doing because like again he was an amateur and like, there wasn't a lot of
Hmm.
knowledge on the subject, but he was very interested, so he went into a Mazatec community, which is like in the mountains of Oaxaca, and like asked about it and eventually like found himself into like the ritual, like one of the main shamans of the community, which
Hmm.
like he did this through lying. So like psychedelic rituals are often done in order to find people or missing important objects, right? And he said
Hmm.
that like his son had been lost and that's why he was using the ritual, but he just wanted to know about the experience of the mushrooms. So in that sense he was already violating the space, right? And
Oh my God, one in ethical considerations.
literally so, and also what this like what members. Mm.
Minerva.
Mm.
Okay, so sorry, Prof.
We
Carl,
will
we need
move.
to move.
We should put this in the podcast.
Can you please give us five on like confidence?
There are brief like
Hi, Prof. Carl.
intermission.
We had an intervention and we've been dislocated.
Yeah,
Yeah, but this is not about colonialism.
it could be. Um, yeah. So I mean, let's return, I
Yeah,
guess, to the
yeah.
story of
Tell me,
Maria
tell me
Sabina.
about this hash. Tell me about the localization on how media and how certain figures um, pursued and interpreted the use of psychedelics.
Yeah. So that's I think like a very interesting thing that happens, right? So when Robert Watson comes into like Maria Sabina's home and they do the ritual. Like he takes a bunch of pictures. Maria Sabina allows it because she's like, okay, whatever, it's your memory or something. Um, and she also allows him, like I think he records her and like he came in several times. But the
Mhm.
the thing is like Maria Sabina told them explicitly, do not publish my name, do not publish our community, do not
Mm-hmm.
publish the pictures. What does Robert Watson proceed to do? He puts another name and have another, like he says the community is mystic and not masotic,
Mm-hmm.
but he ends up publishing the pictures and like ends up making this article that goes in like Life magazine,
Mm.
which was very famous. I mean, it's still very famous. So like it essentially explodes, right? And like interest in
Yeah.
psychedelic explodes within like scientific communities because of
Mm-hmm.
like the way that he's describing it. And it's also like a very interesting thing.
Wait. Scientific communities also read Life magazine. Is
Yes,
that right?
I guess so.
That's so interesting because I feel like Life magazine is like the TikTok of their time. And I would definitely give them low scores on source quality.
Mm. Yeah, and indeed, like Watson's interpretations of like what's happening are
Mm-hmm.
very kind of like lower scores on source
Yeah.
quality, right? Um, but it does represent kind of like a localized like global rupture
Mm-hmm.
because like there's this small community in Mexico that is being suddenly targeted by every single
Mm-hmm.
motherfucking hippie in the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like changes like very deeply how the West thinks um about many things.
Mm-hmm.
And like amongst them like psychology, like ontology, metaphysics, etc. And that brings to like a rupture in like Western thought that like in our opinion, or at least in our
Mm-hmm.
argument, like leads to the summer of love, right? Like
Yeah.
in San Francisco and the development of the hippie movement and the
Mm-hmm.
anti-war movements in the US, which were very like relevant ultimately globally,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's a lot of like global narratives that are
Mm-hmm.
like conjoining at this space, like this small community in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico. And at the same time they like continue to evolve even today, right, into
Yeah.
like new scientific narratives about psychedelics, and that leads to like general interest like of
Mm-hmm.
science and of like the population
Mm-hmm.
on getting high. So yeah, I think it's like a very interesting story, right? But I think there's also like an interesting and very concerning and even
Mm-hmm.
disturbing level of power with which like Watson is like
Yeah.
reaching into like Sabina's home, right? Like so we have a little bit of the text um that he published, and we're just gonna
Yeah,
like
I'd
read a
love to
few
hear.
phrases. Yeah. So for example, like he says, like soon the phrases became articulate syllables. He's talking
Mm-hmm.
about like Sabina singing, each disconnected syllable cutting the darkness sharply. Then by stages the señora came forth with a full-bodied canticle, sung like very ancient music. It seemed to me at the time like an intro to the ancient of days. And like he has this whole trip about seeing this like woman dressed in like what he calls like primitive attire, and like it's,
Oh.
yeah, it's very like racist. And in that sense, like kind of that's, I mean, I bring this up not like just to like shit on Watson, right? But
Mm-hmm.
like because it like is very telling of like how
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics are still spoken about today, right?
Yeah.
Like there's scientific articles that talk about it from ancient magic to modern medicine,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like psychedelics and the humongous amount of like indigenous
Mm-hmm.
knowledge that comes with them,
Mm-hmm.
like not only indigenous but also ecological, right? Like knowledge that comes with
Mm-hmm.
them is being absolutely ignored by science in a way
Yeah.
to materialize them and
Yeah.
also to like regulate them into pharmacology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I absolutely agree. There was this reader, I forgot the name. I'll put it in a video in a text format. But basically, they suggest that the effect of stripping down the context from the use of these substances, the cultural context and religious context, it creates a almost a product,
Mm.
and it's very consumable in a way. And they also suggest, in order to cope with this, we should actually include the semantic context
Mm.
of these substances. Because sadly, nowadays, we actually don't have any evidence, any proper scientific evidence on how these substances work, what can they be beneficial for, what they can be dangerous for also.
Mm-hmm.
And this is such a huge taboo. It's really interesting that also how different types of communities are interested in using these substances.
I guess like just to like recapitulate and like close
Yeah,
a little bit of the story, like tell me a little bit like Elul about like the silent histories, right, that can happen.
yeah. There's a lot to say about this issue, but I think initially I'm thinking about the first group of Spanish colonizers who arrived at New Spain, and they went out, they experienced the culture, and they journaled, they took notes, and they sent these notes back to Europe. And most of these content was flawed, it was biased. And this reminds me of the moment of fact creation. Trujillo mentions this, and I think it's very crucial because most of these content that they sent back to Europe, it was consumed by scientists, politicians, social workers, students, normal people, and it shaped the minds of people at that time. And I think we're still experiencing it. So that's why this problem is a very lingering problem.